Today we're counting down 10 villains who were physically weak, but nearly impossible to defeat. Here's the thing about dangerous villains that nobody's talking about. They were never the strongest. They were never the fastest. They never won fights with their fists. They won with something far harder to defeat. And by the time their enemies realized the game they were playing, it was already too late. Quick question before we get into this list. What if I told you that the villain who caused the most irreversible damage never threw a single punch? Not one. Not ever. You'd think that was impossible. You'd think physical dominance was a prerequisite for villainy. You'd be wrong. At number 1, we have a surprise that makes this list truly unforgettable. This character is unlike anyone else featured here, and chances are you'll never see it coming. In fact, as a villainy expert, I'd be willing to bet it's someone you would never even think to guess. Let's test that theory right now. Number 10. Elijah Price / Mr. Glass. Unbreakable. His bones broke so easily that he earned a childhood nickname, Mr. Glass. Elijah Price was born with osteogenesis imperfecta, a condition so severe that a stumble, a grab, a misstep could shatter his skeleton. As a child, he was carried in a blanket, protected from the world, defined by what his body couldn't do. And from that broken body, one of cinema's most dangerous minds emerged. Here's what makes Elijah Price uniquely terrifying. He didn't let his weakness define him. He weaponized it. His body was useless for confrontation, so he built an empire of the mind, a gallery, a theory, a conviction so absolute that he was willing to orchestrate mass casualty events, derailments, fires, building collapses, simply to prove it. Not for revenge, not for power, for validation. He believed that if the world contained someone as breakable as him, it must also contain someone unbreakable. And he was willing to sacrifice hundreds of lives to find that person. That's not villainy born of strength. That's villainy born of obsession. And obsession doesn't require a single working bone in your body. He didn't need muscles. He needed meaning. And meaning, wielded with enough conviction, can be more dangerous than any weapon. Let me pause for a second. Think about what it means to be so fragile that a handshake could hospitalize you, and yet be the most dangerous person in the room. That's not bravery. That's asymmetry. The threat doesn't come from what you can do. It comes from what you're willing to have done. Number 9. Kaiser Söze. The usual suspects. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. For most of the film, Kaiser Söze feels more like a myth than a man. Stories describe him as a criminal mastermind capable of controlling entire organizations through fear alone. Nobody knows where he is. Nobody knows what he looks like. And that's exactly what makes him unstoppable. Think about what it means to be feared by people who have never seen you, who aren't even certain you're real. Söze doesn't need soldiers. He doesn't need weapons. He needs only the idea of himself. His power isn't physical domination. It's psychological occupation. He lives rent-free in the minds of every criminal who's heard his name. People destroy themselves simply because they believe he's watching. Because here's the thing about fear. It doesn't require the source to be present. It doesn't even require the source to be real. It requires only the belief that the threat exists. and Söze understood that belief is more powerful than any weapon you can hold. He doesn't leave bodies. He leaves systems of fear so entrenched that they self-perpetuate long after he's gone. Keep that thread in mind. It's going to matter. But the next villain didn't just manipulate individuals. He manipulated reality itself, building a labyrinth of death so intricate that even his own mortality couldn't stop it. Number 8. Jigsaw. Saw franchise. John Kramer was dying. Cancer had hollowed out his body. Most days he looked like a man who could barely stand. Yet he became one of horror's most effective villains. Why? Because Jigsaw understood something that eludes every brute force villain. You don't need strength when you have engineering. Every trap was planned years in advance, every variable accounted for, every contingency embedded into the design. Kramer treated human behavior like a physics equation, and he was always solving for the outcome you didn't see coming. Defeating the man was easy. He was already dying. Defeating the idea was impossible. Even after death, his influence continued, through followers, through contingency plans, through traps that hadn't been triggered yet. Jigsaw achieved what most villains only dream of. He made himself posthumous. And before you say, obviously, I need you to hear why he's only number 8, because the reason might surprise you. His traps were genius. His planning was impeccable. But his reach was limited to individuals. He scarred people one at a time. The villains ahead of him, they scarred populations. Number 7. Norman Bates. Psycho. Norman Bates isn't physically intimidating. He's shy, awkward, almost sympathetic. But beneath that fragile exterior hides one of cinema's most disturbing minds. The brilliance of Norman Bates isn't that he's dangerous, it's that he's invisible, even to himself. His split identity means the person committing the violence genuinely doesn't know they're doing it. There's no mask to remove. There's no villain to confront. The threat and the innocent are the same person, occupying the same body, sharing the same face. And that's what makes him nearly impossible to defeat. How do you stop someone who doesn't know they're the threat? Audiences don't recognize the danger until it's too late, and neither do his victims. Because here's the thing about Norman Bates. The horror isn't in what he does. It's in the fact that the person doing it isn't there. The violence happens in the gaps between identities, in the moments when neither self is watching. You can't predict it. You can't reason with it. And you certainly can't fight it. Number 6. The Penguin. Batman Returns. Compared to Batman's gallery of monsters, Oswald Cobblepot looks almost pathetic. Short, deformed, socially isolated. A man who couldn't win a fistfight against most civilians. But underestimate him, and you've already lost. The Penguin understands something fundamental about power. It's not about who's strongest. It's about who controls the narrative. He weaponizes public perception. He turns sympathy into armor. He turns the city's own institutions against their protectors. You can't punch your way out of a PR campaign. You can't roundhouse kick public opinion. The Penguin proves that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a fist. It's influence. Controlling people will always be more efficient than fighting them. And here's what I find most fascinating about him. He doesn't need to win the fight. He needs to win the crowd. Because once the crowd is on his side, the fight is already over. Batman can't punch public sympathy. He can't tase a man the city has decided to protect. The Penguin weaponizes the one thing Batman can't fight: the will of the people. Number 5. Gus Fring. Breaking Bad Gus Fring rarely raises his voice. He doesn't flex his power. He doesn't need to. His calm demeanor masks an empire built on precision and fear. What makes Gus terrifying isn't strength. It's discipline. Every action is calculated, every contingency accounted for. Every relationship, whether with employees, rivals, or law enforcement, is a piece on a board only he can see in full. He runs a fried chicken franchise the way a general runs a military campaign. And the terrifying part? He's been doing it for decades. Nobody in his organization even questions the structure because Gus designed it so that questioning never occurs to anyone. You don't beat Gus because he's stronger. You lose because he's already thought 10 steps ahead. Let me start with the undeniable fact. Gus Fring built an empire so invisible that the DEA couldn't find it. A man so disciplined that his enemies didn't know they were his enemies until it was too late. His physical weakness, a restaurant owner, a businessman, not a fighter, was irrelevant because his system was the weapon, not his body. We've reached the top 4, and from here forward, these villains become so powerful that entire governments, heroes, and worlds struggled to stop them. And before you say, obviously, I need you to hear why number 4 is only number 4. Because the reason might surprise you. Number 4. Lex Luthor. Batman vs. Superman / Superman the movie / DC Comics. A mortal man. No superpowers. No enhanced strength. No combat training worth mentioning. Standing across from a god. And that god is afraid of him. Here's what I find most fascinating about Lex Luthor. He doesn't fight Superman physically because he can't, and he knows it. So he attacks the one thing Superman can't defend with heat vision or super strength: his moral framework. Luthor's genius isn't in building weapons. It's in identifying the psychological pressure points of an invulnerable being and squeezing until the integrity fractures. He turns public opinion against Superman. He corrupts institutions. He manipulates governments into treating a savior as a threat. He doesn't need kryptonite. He needs doubt. Luthor's deepest danger is ideological. He doesn't just want Superman dead. He wants the idea of Superman discredited. He wants humanity to believe that power, any power beyond human control, is inherently untrustworthy, and he's willing to sacrifice everything, including his own soul, to prove it. You can't outrun a narrative. You can't punch your way out of institutional corruption, and you can't fly fast enough to escape a man who's already turned the world against you. That's why he's only number 4. Because as devastating as Luthor's methodology is, he's still operating within a single world against a single hero. The villains ahead of him, they didn't just target individuals. They rewrote civilizations. Number 3. Voldemort. Harry Potter Saga. Physically, Voldemort isn't imposing. He's thin, almost skeletal. A body that looks like it's held together by will alone. But raw magical power compensates for every physical weakness. Entire generations lived in fear of speaking his name. Not his face, not his army. His name. That's not fear of violence. That's psychological occupation at a civilizational scale. Voldemort understood that controlling what people are allowed to say is the first step toward controlling what they're allowed to think. Even death couldn't permanently stop him. He fragmented his own soul 7 times to ensure that no single defeat could be final. But the most dangerous thing about Voldemort wasn't his power. It was his obsession. He would sacrifice anything: his humanity, his appearance, his capacity for love, for the sake of dominance. And that's what makes him nearly impossible to defeat. You can't reason with someone who has already burned every bridge to their own humanity. Because here's the thing about obsession. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't compromise. It doesn't tire. It simply consumes. And Voldemort was willing to be consumed if it meant the world burned with him. Number 2, the High Evolutionary. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. The High Evolutionary isn't a warrior. He's a scientist, a creator, a manipulator. But his intellect allows him to reshape entire species. He doesn't need physical power because he controls life itself. He decides what forms consciousness takes. He decides which beings are worthy of existence and which are discarded as failed iterations. Here's what makes him uniquely terrifying. He doesn't see himself as a villain. He sees himself as an artist, a visionary pursuing perfection through endless, ruthless iteration. And that conviction, that absolute certainty in his own mission, is what makes him unstoppable. His experiments don't just scar bodies, they scar identities. He creates beings who don't know if they're people or products. That's a wound that doesn't heal. Not because he's strong, because he believes he should decide what perfection looks like, and he has the means to enforce it. And before we get to number 1, let me tell you why the High Evolutionary is number 2 and not number 1. Because for all his brilliance, all his power, all his certainty, he was stopped by a raccoon, a tree, a band of misfits who refused to accept his definition of perfection. And now the moment of truth. Can you guess who we selected for number 1? It's not Hans Landa from Inglourious Basterds. It's not Hannibal Lecter from Silence of the Lambs. It's not the Joker from The Dark Knight, nor John Doe from Seven. By the time we're done, you are going to understand why this villain, this frail, elderly woman, accomplished what every other villain on this list could not. She didn't conquer through force. She didn't need intelligence or charisma or ideology. She conquered through proximity. And the only person who stopped her was a child. Number 1, Aunt Gladys. Weapons, 2025. Let me tell you about the most dangerous villain on this list. An elderly woman. Frail, soft-spoken, polite. She arrives at a family's doorstep claiming to be a distant relative, supposedly ill, supposedly in need of care. She looks like someone who needs help, not someone who brings harm. And that is precisely what makes her nearly impossible to defeat. Because here's the thing about Aunt Gladys that nobody on this list shares. Every other villain on this ranking signals danger. Voldemort reshapes his body into something inhuman. The Penguin announces his deformity. Every villain on this list, from Mr. Glass to the High Evolutionary, carries a visible warning that says, "I am a threat." Gladys carries the opposite signal. She carries the signal of vulnerability. And that is her weapon. Not intelligence, though she is patient. Not ideology, though she has purpose. Her weapon is access. She walks through the front door. She sits at the dinner table. She sleeps down the hall from a child. She does what no villain on this list could ever do. She gets inside. Not inside a system, not inside an institution. Inside a home. Inside a family. Once inside, she doesn't need strength. She uses what Zach Kreger based on real sympathetic magic, hair, clothing, personal items, to seize control of everyone around her. Alex's parents fall into trance-like obedience. Police officers, neighbors, adults who should have been the barrier between a child and danger become the instruments of that danger. 17 children disappeared from Maybrook, Pennsylvania. not through force, not through violence, through a woman who sat in a living room, handled personal belongings, and performed a ritual at 2:17 in the morning. Think about what that means. Every protective structure in that town, parents, police, community, was neutralized, not defeated, co-opted. The people who were supposed to protect these children handed them over without knowing they were doing it. Let me pause for a second. Every villain on this list was fought. Superman fought Luthor. Harry fought Voldemort. The Guardians fought the High Evolutionary. Every single one was opposed by someone who recognized the threat. Gladys was never opposed, because nobody knew she was the threat. She looked like the woman who needed a blanket and a bowl of soup. She looked like family. That's a different category of danger. Not the villain you can't beat, the villain you invite in. And here's what I find most fascinating about her. She may have been doing this for over a century. She refers to tuberculosis as consumption, a term from the 1800s. Her memories don't align with timelines. Her age is impossible to verify because she manipulates the memories of everyone around her. She may have been entering homes, draining families, and moving on since before any of us were born. She wasn't a villain who struck once. She was a methodology that repeated across generations. She was practical. Not cruel in the theatrical sense, not dramatic. She didn't monologue. She didn't scheme with armies or build doomsday devices. She needed to sustain herself, and she did it the way a parasite feeds on a host. Quietly, patiently, without the host ever realizing the relationship isn't mutual. That's not villainy born of ambition. That's villainy born of necessity. And necessity doesn't negotiate. Now, here's where it gets remarkable. Every adult in Maybrook was compromised. Every authority figure, every parent, every protector. The entire infrastructure of safety that a town builds around its children. Gone. Not through invasion, through invitation. And the person who stopped her was a child. Alex Lilly, an only child. The boy she had been watching closest. The one she had been forcing to participate in her rituals. The one she had the most access to and, therefore, the most control over. He reversed her spell. He took the very mechanism she used to control the children she had summoned, the ritual, the bell, the connection, and he turned it against her. He ordered the frenzied children to tear her apart. The woman who had controlled everyone was destroyed by the one person she had the most power over. And that's why Aunt Gladys is number one on this list. Not because she was the most powerful, not because she was the most evil, not because she caused the most destruction, because she was the most invisible. Every other villain on this list was identified, confronted, and fought. Gladys was welcomed. She was fed. She was given a bedroom. She was trusted with a child. And by the time anyone understood what she was, 17 children were gone, an entire town was under her control, and the only person left who could act was a boy who should have been her easiest victim. You can't fight what you can't recognize. You can't defend against what you've already invited inside. And you can't prepare for a villain whose greatest weapon is looking like someone who needs your help. That's true villainy. Not overpowering your enemies, becoming someone they protect. These 10 villains prove something that should unsettle you. Physical strength is the most visible form of power and the easiest to defeat. A stronger opponent will always exist. A better fighter will always emerge. A bigger weapon will always be built. But intelligence? Conviction? The willingness to play a game your opponent doesn't even realize they're in? That doesn't break. That doesn't tire. That doesn't expire. The most dangerous villain isn't the one who can destroy you. It's the one who can make you destroy yourself. And the most terrifying part? The villains on this list aren't fiction. They're archetypes. They exist in boardrooms, in governments, in families, in the systems we trust to protect us. And if you want more of Aunt Gladys, check her out in the next video, where we place her in a crossover storyline where she is sure to wreak major havoc. Subscribe to our channel, where more surprises await you.